She tended her garden in the mornings and sat in the same pew every Sunday without fail. Nobody had a reason to speak badly of her. Nobody had a reason to look twice. Then one morning, two girls pointed at her. That was enough. Within days, men came to her door. She was taken from her home in front of her family. There was no warning, no explanation that made sense. Neighbors who had greeted her for years now crossed the street when they heard her name. Her husband said nothing. Her children said nothing. Silence was the only safe answer. She stood before a room full of people who had already decided. She said she was innocent. They wrote it down and kept going. Her garden was still growing when she was hanged. This is what happened during the Salem witch trials, and it could have happened to anyone who lived there. Salem Village, Massachusetts, in the winter of 1692, was a place built on proximity and pressure. The houses were close together, the fields were shared by necessity, and the church sat at the center of everything, not as an option but as the operating system of the entire community. The Puritan settlers who had established that village decades earlier had not come to build a comfortable life. They had come to build a perfect one, a life scrubbed clean of sin, ordered by Scripture, governed by the constant awareness that God was watching and the devil was waiting. Every behavior carried moral weight. Every deviation from the expected was noticed. The community was small enough that nothing was private and rigid enough that nothing was forgiven easily. The land itself created friction. Salem Village and Salem Town were distinct places with competing interests. Farmers on the village side resented the merchants in town. Old families disputed property lines that had never been properly settled. The pastor, Samuel Parris, had arrived in 1689 already carrying controversy. His contract was contested, his salary was delayed, and a significant portion of his own congregation did not want him there. He was a man who experienced opposition as persecution. That posture would matter later. The village ran on a specific logic of social trust. Reputation was the only currency that mattered in the long run. A man's word, a woman's character, a family's standing. These were not abstractions. They determined who received help in hard winters, who was welcomed in disputes, who was believed when conflicts arose. Lose your reputation, and you lost your footing inside the only community you had. There was nowhere else to go. That system was stable until it wasn't. In January of 1692, Betty Parris, the 9-year-old daughter of Samuel Parris, began to behave strangely. She screamed without apparent cause. She contorted her body into positions that seemed involuntary. She complained of being pinched and bitten by something no one else could see. Her cousin Abigail Williams, who lived in the same house, began to show the same symptoms. A neighbor girl, Ann Putnam, soon followed. The village had no framework for what was happening other than the one it had always used. There were no medical institutions capable of offering an alternative diagnosis. The theological worldview of Puritan New England was not a backdrop to daily life. It was the structure of daily life. Within that structure, unexplained physical suffering had a clear cause: the influence of the devil, working through a human agent. Someone was practicing witchcraft. Someone had made a pact with Satan and was directing that power at these girls. The village doctor, William Griggs, examined the afflicted children and offered the diagnosis the community was already expecting. The cause, he concluded, was likely supernatural. That conclusion, from a man of medicine, closed the door on every other explanation. The search for the guilty began immediately. The first names offered were predictable in their logic. Tituba was an enslaved woman from Barbados who worked in the Parris household. She had no legal standing, no community protection, and no social capital to spend in her own defense. Sarah Good was a homeless woman who begged door to door and was known for muttering under her breath when turned away, behavior that the community had long interpreted with suspicion. Sarah Osborne was elderly, ill, had not attended church in over a year, and had been involved in a property dispute with the Putnam family. None of the three were pillars of the community. All three were women the village had already decided to distrust. Tituba confessed. Her confession was not simple. It was detailed, elaborate, and it named others. She described a tall man who made her sign a book. She described other witches. She gave the court exactly what it needed to expand the investigation outward, and in doing so, She became the engine of the machine that would consume hundreds of people who had done nothing at all. Her confessions saved her life. That fact was not lost on anyone watching. The court that handled the Salem trials was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, a specialized tribunal convened by Governor William Phips in May of 1692, specifically to address the accumulating accusations. The judges appointed to it were not fringe figures. They were respected men of the colony. Samuel Stoughton, the chief judge, was the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. The court had the full weight of the colonial government behind it. The rules of evidence inside that court created a system with no exit. Spectral evidence was the foundation. Under the theological assumptions of the time, witnesses could testify that the accused appeared to them in dreams or visions as a spirit, a shape, a presence, and tormented them. The afflicted girls used this form of testimony constantly. They would erupt in apparent seizures during proceedings, pointing at the accused and screaming that the defendant's spectre was attacking them at that very moment, in that very room. The judges watched this happen and treated it as confirmation. There was no way to refute spectral evidence. A person cannot prove that their spirit did not appear somewhere. The theological logic underpinning the court's acceptance of this evidence was equally airtight. Puritan doctrine held that the devil could not assume the shape of an innocent person. Therefore, if your spectre was seen doing harm, you could not be innocent. The accusation was the proof, that was the trap. Being accused placed a person in a position where every possible response made things worse. Denial was interpreted as the stubbornness of guilt. Silence was interpreted as admission. Showing anger was evidence of a guilty conscience. Weeping too much could be interpreted as manipulation. The afflicted girls controlled the room. Their physical reactions during testimony functioned as a real-time verdict that the judges deferred to rather than challenged. The only path that consistently led away from execution was confession. Confess, name others, and cooperate with the court. Those who confessed were not immediately hanged. They were held, questioned further, used as witnesses against new accused. The court needed the confessions to keep the trials moving forward. The living confessors were more useful than dead martyrs. The machine required new names to survive. Everyone who confessed understood implicitly or explicitly that survival meant feeding someone else to the court. The community was eating itself one accusation at a time, and the only way to stop was to be powerful enough that no one dared point at you, or to already be dead. By the summer of 1692, the accusations had moved far beyond the margins of Salem village society. The afflicted girls were naming people with standing, people with property, people with families who had resources and connections. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old. She was a full member of the Salem Village Church, had raised a large family, and was regarded by most of her neighbors as a model of Christian virtue. Her name came up in March. Her family gathered signatures from 39 neighbors, attesting to her character. The jury initially returned a verdict of not guilty. The judge sent them back. Samuel Stoughton, looking at the jury that had just acquitted Rebecca Nurse, pointed to a statement she had made during testimony that he considered incriminating. He told the jurors to reconsider.
Not guilty.
The foreman went back to Nurse and asked her to clarify her statement. She was hard of hearing and did not respond. The jury took her silence as confirmation and reversed the verdict. She was convicted. She was excommunicated from the church, where she had worshipped for decades. She was hanged on July 19, 1692, along with 4 other women. Her conviction was the clearest signal the trials ever produced. If Rebecca Nurse could be condemned, no one was safe. Virtue was not a defense. Church membership was not a defense. Decades of demonstrated good character were not a defense. The court had made clear through the mechanics of her trial that the process of accusation was already the process of conviction. The gap between the two had become administrative, not substantive. People who understood this began to flee. Others refused to appear before the court at all. Giles Corey was 81 years old. His wife Martha had already been accused. He had initially given testimony that was used against her, a fact that may have driven what he did next. When the court came for him, he refused to enter a plea. Under English law at the time, a defendant who refused to plead could not be tried. The court's response was a procedure called peine forte dure. The accused was laid on the ground. Stones were placed on a board across his chest, one at a time, with the pressure increasing until a plea was entered or the body failed. Giles Corey did not enter a plea. He was pressed over the course of 2 days. He did not confess. He did not cooperate. The sheriff, according to accounts from the period, pushed his tongue back into his mouth with a cane when it protruded from the weight. His last recorded words were a demand for more weight. He died on September 19, 1692. His refusal accomplished something. It denied the court the authority it was claiming. He could not be tried, convicted, or hanged. His property, which would have been forfeit upon conviction, passed to his heirs. His death was a deliberate act of structural resistance from a man who had nothing left to protect except his refusal to participate. Not everyone had that option. 19 people were hanged at Gallows Hill between June and September of 1692. 5 more died in prison before their cases could be heard. 1 man was pressed to death. Over 200 people had been formally accused by the time the court suspended operations. Hundreds more had been named informally, their lives disrupted, their reputations damaged in ways that did not dissolve when the trials ended. The Court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved by Governor Phipps in October of 1692. The timing was not coincidental. By that point, the accusations had reached people whose positions made their prosecution politically and legally inconvenient. Phipps's own wife had been named. The pressure from prominent Boston clergy, including Increase Mather, had been building for months. Mather published a pamphlet arguing that it was better for guilty people to go free than for innocent people to die, a position the court had effectively inverted throughout the summer. The machine stopped not because it was proven wrong, but because it had become dangerous to the people who had the power to stop it. A new court was convened in early 1693. It excluded spectral evidence. The acquittals came quickly. Those still held in prison were released. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed legislation exonerating many of the convicted and authorizing reparations to surviving family members. The amounts paid were modest against the losses suffered. The exonerations were incomplete for decades. Some of the condemned were not formally cleared until the 20th century. What Salem produced in 1692 was not an aberration generated by unusual evil or exceptional stupidity. It was the predictable output of a specific set of conditions. A closed community under sustained pressure, a legal framework that inverted the burden of proof, a theological system that made accusations structurally equivalent to evidence, and a social environment where the cost of dissent was high enough that most people who doubted the process stayed quiet. The accused who survived were those who confessed to things they had not done and named people who had done nothing. The accused who maintained their innocence were hanged. The community that built the machine watched it operate and largely permitted it. Because the alternative, to stand up and say the court was wrong, required a willingness to become the next name on the list. That willingness was rare. Innocence in Salem in 1692 was not a shield. It was simply a fact that the system had no mechanism to recognize.